tourists and business travelers from 24 countries, most of which are in the African continent, could pay up to $15,000 to bag a U.S. visa. This new requirement from the Donald Trump administration was revealed this week. For more on this, we speak now to Professor Patrick Bond. He's a professor of political economy at the University of the Western Cape. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. A very curious decision from Donald Trump, but we've come to expect that. So this parting shot meaning what for African countries in particular?
Well, look, he's got many parting shots still to come, including all manner of attacks on people and the environment. His most controversial will no doubt be challenging the election. December 14 is the day where he probably loses, when the certification happens in the Electoral College, and he's pardoning people. So we're looking at a man quite desperate, and with the attack by apparently Israeli undercover troops on the Iranian nuclear scientist with U.S. backing and potentially a U.S. move on Iran. It's a dangerous time, and this is a bit of a distraction. It'll probably last a few months. It's about a 230,000 rand visa bond requirement, and I don't think the U.S. consulates around Africa are going to be in a position even to take that money. They're not really well equipped. So this is sort of experimental. And just like Donald Trump did back in 2017, he immediately upon coming to office said, I don't want Muslims visiting me. So these are the countries, including 3 from Africa, where no one can come at all, not even to change planes. And later he said Africa had S-hole countries, and I think these are the kinds of indications, along with the racism in the U.S. and Black Lives Matter coming up as a result, that reflects, I think, good riddance for anyone who is opposed to that sort of racism and blunt imperialist activity from the United States.
You've got countries on the list like Angola, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cape Verde, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance. So you've got some people that would be very happy to pay this because they can afford it. And then you've got on the other end of the spectrum people who would not be able to pay and afford this. So when we look at incoming President Joe Biden, he has indicated that he could reverse some of the decisions that were made by President Donald Trump, like the Muslim ban. Could this be something that could be reversed as well?
Oh, for sure. And because, as you've correctly pointed out, it's extreme class politics. So if you're rich and you want to go to the U.S. once the COVID-19 restrictions are lower, and, we have many bans on people from the U.S. coming here, I think correctly so, since Trump has mishandled COVID so badly. Then the next question is, will the man who's taking over from Mike Pompeo, current Secretary of State, blustering, very, sort of bullying kind of guy, and his name's Tony Blinken. He's a career diplomat. And will he want to bring African votes in the United Nations his way, and therefore make that a fairly high priority to end this very clear discriminatory policy? Tony Blinken has a checkered history on the continent because he was very much in favor of the Libyan intervention. Do you remember in 2011 it was catastrophic? It still is one of the great stains on U.S. Sort of imperial neoconservative policy under the Obama government. And unfortunately, there's been no reckoning of that kind of politics. So whether it's what's sometimes called neoliberal, which is pro-corporate, or neoconservative, which is pro-democracy as a guise for invasion, it'll be a relief to replace Donald Trump with those philosophies. Trump was what we would call a paleo-conservative. But nevertheless, I think Africa is going to have to be very careful, especially AFRICOM may make a comeback, and the legitimation of U.S. aggression under Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and other new characters could become quite a problem.
The rationale behind this is that it's targeted at people who overstay their visas once they get to the United States. Is that something that is reasonable on the part of the country to say, well, perhaps just to deter people from doing something like this, let's do this? Or would you find that people are like, well, I could hustle that money so that I could stay there anyway beyond my visa expiring?
Well, if it's worth the $15,000 that you would lose for violating the bond. But, again, it's class politics, isn't it? It's about those who could afford that. But it's also something very terrible in U.S. foreign policy, which is collective punishment, something that Trump, with his generalizations, his overall racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, he has not worried about making generalizations. So if you come from Angola and 10% of people from Angola stay over, that in his mind justifies. So it's not even about people, it's about a national 10% barrier. And I suppose luckily South Africans haven't crossed that. South Africans have respected those. But, you know, with the desire in this country to restore tourism, to restore those flights from Newark Airport, from Atlanta Airport, from Dulles Airport, from JFK, you know, this is going to be a barrier because a lot of the traffic that goes back and forth using Johannesburg as a hub, you know, would come from Angola or DRC or some of the other sites. Now, Ethiopia's kept that going through Ethiopian Airlines out of the Addis hub. It's going to be interesting to see if there's any rearrangement and the huge shrinkage of the airline industry and of long-distance tourism and some of these business relationships and the rise of our ability now to do this by video teleconferencing may make some of these debates about who goes back and forth to the U.S. a little less important these next 6 months before Tony Blinken hopefully can come in and change that awful policy.
I'd like us to focus on Tony Blinken. You've touched a bit on him, Joe Biden's new Secretary of State. You mentioned a little bit earlier on that he's got a checkered past, especially where the African continent is concerned, at least. What is it that you're looking forward to from him? It sounds like it's not much.
Oh, you know, the dilemma is that he and a few of the others, including the probable defense secretary, the minister of war, really, since there's a very militaristic in the U.S., they've come from the consultancy circuits over the last 4 years after they were pushed out by Trump. And in those circuits, you really learn a lot about what they call the blob, right? The foreign policy establishment has this sort of nickname. Some call it the military-industrial complex, some call it the deep state. But what you really get is a sense that the big corporates that spend, in the case of Biden, over $1.5 billion to get him elected, that huge amount of money, a lot of it from big corporates that set up the, you know, sort of, let's say, consultancy relationships with people like Tony Blinken, they're, you know, able to pull the strings later on. I think again and again we saw even someone with the principles of Barack Obama turning in a pretty brutal way, like, you know, forcing chlorinated chicken parts on South Africa on behalf of the big poultry industry, parts of the South, against South Africa and threatening the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, you know, benefits. And that's the kind of thing that makes the U.S., well, the world's bullies, right, the imperialists. And the big dilemma, does South Africa go hand in hand now that there's a new government as a sub-imperialist ally, which was a tendency with Barack Obama to sort of seduce us in, or and especially because there's a new African head of the World Trade Organization coming in, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was the finance minister for Nigeria. Will there maybe be a little bit more scope? And I think the biggest question is over the vaccines for COVID-19. Will U.S. companies continue to demand intellectual property rights? You remember the way they did with AIDS medicines, for branded medicines, a monopoly, tyrannical 20-year monopoly on this intellectual property, which made them, you know, unaffordable, 150,000 rand you'd need. And it was only with the generics and it was only with the WTO reforming with the trade-related intellectual property system led by South African activists, the Treatment Action Campaign, that broke, and we had a huge increase in life expectancy getting the generics. We desperately need that now as the next site of struggle over where the United States foreign policy and economic interests lie.
With all of that being said, come the 1st of January 2021, the African Continental Free Trade movement is set to get underway, which is something that is billed as something that will save the continent, if you will, and take us on a different trajectory, which we've been waiting for a very long time. You also mentioned Ms. Ngozi's appointment, which, you know, many Africans are looking forward to, saying, well, perhaps she'd champion our cause as well. There's something to look forward to, no?
Yes and no. Let's not say Africa is one big unified bloc. I mean, what Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala did, right, for 25 years at the World Bank was support the sort of neoliberal power bloc, the financiers. She was very committed to repaying debt that others said, no, that's illegitimate. So the World Bank training she got, and her role as a finance minister, and she imposed subsidy cuts that nearly caused a revolution in January 2012. So she certainly represents part of an African elite, and that elite would like to trade across the continent without these terrible border barriers. I mean, there's a 60-kilometer queue right now between Uganda and Kenya just to get goods across. I mean, it's insane. And so I don't know if the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement will work, given that many African countries enjoy the benefits of border taxes and tariffs to run their government. I mean, that's unfortunately one of the barriers to an intercontinental arrangement. The other is that there's countries like Nigeria and certainly South Africa, where you have big companies that can certainly benefit from this, but perhaps at the expense of localization, of local industrial development. So these are the debates going on all the time, including here in South Africa. Should we localize, have reindustrialization, or continue to import, from East Asia, very cheap labor, lack of environmental standards? South Africa does have a reputation of being a bully in these circuits, like the U.S. internationally. And so it's going to have to walk carefully not to be seen to just sucking up an African market at the expense of local producers. And with our retailers going up continent, they've already been accused of that, bringing in local chickens, local produce, instead of buying from in South Africa, instead of buying locally.
It's a mess. Thank you very much, Professor Patrick Bond, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Cape Town.